So what if the most powerful, terrifying empires in human history, from ancient Babylon to, the modern superpowers we see today,
Mm.
what if they aren't actually driving the plot of history?
Right. Which is a wild thought.
It really is. I mean, if you're listening to this right now and you're feeling completely overwhelmed by the morning headlines, watching borders shift and economies tremble, this deep dive is going to fundamentally flip how you view the global stage.
Yeah, we usually just assume history is this runaway train, right?
Right.
And it's driven by whoever happens to have the most money or the biggest army.
Exactly, or just the loudest microphone. But today, we're dismantling the illusion of human empire.
It is a pervasive illusion, too. I mean, you look at the world, and the default assumption is that the strongest human actors are the ones writing the script.
Yeah.
We tend to view history in a binary way. It's either entirely random and chaotic, or it belongs entirely to the conquerors. And both of those are terrifying options.
They really are.
Yeah.
But there is this ancient framework that offers a completely different paradigm.
Yes.
And that's exactly what we're unpacking today.
Yeah.
We're looking at a sweeping theological worldview mapped out by Chris R. Velasquez. It's from a comprehensive document and some really detailed infographics titled God's Sovereignty Over Nations. Empires Serve God's Purposes.
It's a massive exploration. What Velasquez has done is synthesize this strictly biblical and theological perspective on geopolitics and, human ambition.
Right.
We're essentially mapping the DNA of superpowers, all the way from the ancient narratives of Genesis through the brutal reigns of Egypt and Babylon, straight into the Roman Empire and the visions of Revelation.
So our mission today is to dive deep into this worldview. We want to understand how this framework claims that God uses mighty empires as like mere instruments.
Tools in a grander design.
Exactly. Tools, without ever actually endorsing their corruption or their tyranny or their violence.
And right out of the gate, I think we need to establish a very clear perimeter for this conversation.
But definitely.
Because we are dealing with deeply theological and potentially politically resonant concepts. So we want to be explicit. We were here to examine the claims, the philosophical frameworks, and the biblical narratives exactly as Velasquez presents them.
Yeah, we aren't here to endorse a specific religious doctrine. And we certainly aren't here to validate any political ideologies that someone might, try to extrapolate from this.
Right. No side-taking here.
Think of it like putting on a theological virtual reality headset. We are stepping into the architecture of this historically massive way of viewing the world. We want you, the listener, to understand this profound alternative perspective on human history. We're just looking impartially to understand its internal logic.
Precisely. And to truly understand that internal logic, we have to start by attacking that core assumption we just mentioned, the idea that the loudest, most heavily armed humans dictate reality.
Yeah.
In this framework, saying that God has sovereignty over nations is not just some pious, comforting slogan you slap on a bumper sticker. It's presented as an absolute judgment about the nature of reality itself.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because this entire concept hinges on a very specific claim found in the book of Daniel. Specifically, Daniel 2.21, which states that God changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings.
Which is a staggering claim.
It really is, especially when you think about the geopolitical realities of the ancient world. It essentially argues that historical heavyweights, like Pharaoh in Egypt or Caesar in Rome, were all acting as unwitting servants in a divine drama.
It completely decentralizes human power. It strips the emperor of his perceived godhood.
But I need to challenge the mechanics of this, because if we aren't careful, this just sounds like fatalism.
I see where you're going with this.
Right. Like, if God is setting up tyrants and removing them, isn't he just an accomplice to their tyranny? If a dictator slaughters thousands, and this framework says God set him up, how does this worldview avoid making God the author of that evil?
That is the central paradox. It's the philosophical knot at the heart of this entire text.
Yeah.
How do you have God governing nations without being morally implicated in their corruption? The framework navigates this by defining divine sovereignty as comprehensive, not reactive, while still maintaining human culpability. To really get this, we need to talk about compatibilism.
Break that down for us. What do you mean by comprehensive versus reactive, and where does compatibilism fit in?
Think of it this way. The biblical God is not described as a crisis manager.
Yep.
He isn't sitting in heaven watching a political disaster unfold on earth and scrambling to formulate a plan B. He isn't playing whack-a-mole with bad human decisions. His sovereignty is comprehensive, meaning it encompasses the entirety of the timeline from beginning to end.
Right.
However, and this is where compatibilism comes in, this overarching divine control is compatible with genuine human free will and moral responsibility.
So the human rulers aren't just like robots executing a predetermined code.
Exactly. They are making real, deeply flawed choices driven by their own pride, their greed, their lust for power. When an emperor oppresses a marginalized group, he is acting entirely out of his own wicked volition.
He's culpable.
He is completely culpable. But, and this is the radical shift in perspective, the framework argues that God is so infinitely powerful that he can take those entirely free, entirely wicked choices and weave them seamlessly into a narrative that ultimately serves his own righteous ends.
You know, it makes me think of an author and their characters. Like William Shakespeare writing Macbeth.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Right. In the world of the play, Macbeth makes real, deeply flawed choices. He chooses to murder the king. He chooses to listen to his ambition. Shakespeare isn't stepping onto the stage and forcing Macbeth's hand.
Right, Macbeth is acting freely according to his own dark character.
Exactly. Yet, Shakespeare wrote the play. He governs the overarching plot to arrive at a specific tragic conclusion. So in this worldview, God is the author, and the emperors are the actors who think they are writing the script themselves.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it. Macbeth is fully guilty of his treason, yet his treason is exactly what Shakespeare uses to drive the narrative forward. The rulers of these empires imagine they are acting autonomously. They think their military strategy is securing their legacy, but they are operating entirely within a theater constructed by God. He directs the flow of history without approving of the evil acts committed within it.
If you really internalize that as a listener, think about how it drastically lowers the temperature of modern political panic.
Oh, absolutely.
If the most terrifying superpower on the globe right now is actually just a temporary character in a play they don't even realize they're in, it fundamentally changes how you process fear.
It changes everything.
But to really grasp how these empires became props in the first place, we have to rewind. If empires are just instruments, where did the concept of a nation or an empire even originate in this narrative?
We have to go back to the origins of human society as recorded in Genesis. The biblical foundations section of Elastus's timeline spends a lot of time in Genesis 10 and 11.
Setting the stage.
Right, setting the stage with the table of nations. After the flood, you see humanity spreading out, developing different cultures, territories, and languages. And initially, this diversification is presented as a good thing.
Right, fulfilling the mandate to fill the earth.
Exactly. It's humanity spreading out under providential care.
But then we hit a massive roadblock. Yeah. The Tower of Babel.
Yes. And we really need to strip away the Sunday school flannel graph version of Babel, where it's just a story about people building a tall brick tower and God getting annoyed by the architecture.
Right, it's not a zoning dispute.
No, not at all. This framework presents Babel as a deep, collective, terrifying rebellion. It is the genesis of the imperial mindset. The text describes human civilization uniting in one place with one language for one specific purpose, to make a name for itself.
So it's the very first centralized imperial project of self-exaltation.
Precisely. They are using their shared language and their technological advancements, brick and mortar, not to steward the earth, but to storm the heavens. To secure their own ultimate power and permanence without any need for the divine. It is humanity declaring itself God.
Wait, I have to stop you and push back on this, because to a modern listener, the punishment here seems incredibly counterintuitive.
How so?
Well, humanity is coming together. They are cooperating. They are breaking down barriers, ending conflict, and building something massive together. Isn't unity universally considered a good thing? Why is global cooperation at Babel treated as this toxic imperial rebellion that requires God to step in, confuse their language, and scatter them?
That is exactly the friction the text wants you to feel. Unity in a vacuum is powerful, but the framework argues that unity divorced from truth and righteousness is just scaled-up tyranny.
Oh, interesting.
The problem with Babel wasn't the cooperation. It was the ultimate goal of the cooperation. It was unity for the sake of idolatry. When broken, sinful humans centralize absolute power, you don't get a utopia.
You get a dictatorship.
You get totalitarianism. You get an empire that demands ultimate allegiance and crushes anyone who dissents.
So God scattering the nations and confusing their languages isn't just an arbitrary punishment. It's an act of severe mercy. He's essentially breaking up a monopoly on human power before it can totally consume the world in a unified tyranny.
Exactly. He shatters the imperial project. The dispersal of the nations is an act of judgment against the arrogance of empire. But, And this is where the narrative pivots beautifully. God doesn't just scatter them and walk away.
Right.
The source points out that immediately after the disaster of Babel in Genesis 11, you turn the page to Genesis 12, and God initiates a rescue mission. But he doesn't do it by building a bigger, better empire. He calls one single elderly man, Abraham.
And this introduces a concept that I want us to really break down because it's easily misunderstood. The text says that the calling of Abraham's family, which eventually becomes the nation of Israel, represents an election that is instrumental, not exclusionary.
Right.
What does that actually mean in plain English?
It means they were chosen for a job, not chosen to be an exclusive VIP club. A common misreading of the Old Testament is that God picked Israel because he liked them best and he hated everyone else, and Israel was supposed to just build walls and keep the divine favor to themselves.
Yeah, that's a very common read.
But the text vehemently rejects that.
Right, because Genesis 12:3 says to Abraham, "In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed."
Exactly. God forms a covenant people as a redemptive conduit. Babel was a false, forced unity built on human pride. Abraham's calling was the quiet beginning of a true global mediation.
So the goal was bigger than just one family.
Always. The ultimate plan was always to reclaim, heal, and unite all those scattered nations through divine mercy, not through imperial force. Israel is the instrument of that blessing.
So the stage is set. You have the nations, scattered because of their pride, but still within the scope of God's long-term redemptive plan. And right in the middle of them, you have Israel, this small, vulnerable covenant people. The dynamic of the entire Old Testament is basically this tiny nation trying to survive in a geopolitical neighborhood populated by aggressive, expanding, violent superpowers. Which brings us to what the text outlines as the imperial roster.
And this is where the framework gets incredibly specific. It provides historical case studies to show exactly how God interacts with these aggressive empires. And the common thread is that these empires serve dual roles.
What are the two roles?
They are simultaneously instruments in God's hand, used for discipline, preservation, or judgment, and yet they remain fully morally accountable for their own atrocities.
Let's start with a classic biblical villain, Egypt. When you think of an oppressive empire, you think of Pharaoh.
Right. Egypt is the crucible. It is an instrument of brutal, multi-generational oppression against the Israelites. But the text points out that Egypt is also the necessary stage on which God reveals his ultimate authority. There is a deeply complex psychological and theological dynamic happening in the Exodus narrative. You have Pharaoh, a ruler who literally believes he is a divine being, aggressively hardening his own heart against the demand to let the Israelites go. Yet the biblical text also explicitly states that the Lord hardens Pharaoh's heart.
Okay, we need to pause here because that phrase, the Lord hardens Pharaoh's heart, causes a lot of philosophical whiplash.
It does.
How do we reconcile that with the idea of human culpability we just talked about? If God hardens a tyrant's heart, isn't God responsible for the tyrant's cruelty?
It goes back to that Macbeth analogy. The framework insists we view this through the lens of divine sovereignty, encompassing a ruler's active resistance. Pharaoh already possessed a cruel, arrogant, oppressive heart.
Right, he was already doing terrible things.
Yeah. He had already chosen to enslave and murder. When God hardens Pharaoh's heart, the theological understanding is not that God injects fresh evil into a previously innocent man. Rather, God strategically removes the restraints of common grace, allowing Pharaoh's pre-existing arrogance to solidify into absolute unyielding stubbornness.
So God is essentially saying, you want to be a god. You want to dig your heels in. I will give you over entirely to your own pride, and I will use your inevitable spectacular collapse to prove to the entire world that you are just a man.
Precisely. The plagues and the ultimate defeat of Egypt at the Red Sea aren't just about political liberation for the Israelites.
Yeah.
It is a massive public theological revelation.
A statement.
It is God systematically dismantling the Egyptian pantheon and proving that an empire, no matter how materially powerful, is never a god.
But then we move forward in history, and the dynamic gets even more uncomfortable. We look at the Assyrian Empire. Velocus points to Isaiah 10, where the language is absolutely shocking. God literally calls the Assyrian Empire the rod of my anger. The context here is that Israel has abandoned the covenant, they are steeped in corruption and idolatry, and God uses this terrifying, violent pagan empire to invade and chasten them.
Yes, Assyria is the instrument of divine discipline.
But I have to stop and ask the obvious question here. We are talking about a historical reality of brutal warfare, siege, and mass deportation. How does this theological framework justify God handing over his own covenant people to a violent pagan army just to teach them a lesson?
It's a tough pill to swallow.
It borders on the exact might makes right toxicity that this entire text is supposedly trying to avoid.
It is a profoundly difficult tension, and the text doesn't shy away from it. The justification lies in the concept of covenantal justice. Israel had entered into a binding contract with God, the covenant at Sinai, which clearly outlined the blessings of obedience and the severe curses of rebellion.
And those curses included exile.
Exactly. Exile by foreign nations. God's fulfilling the terms of the contract. However, what rescues this from being a might makes right scenario is what happens next.
Right, because after Assyria does exactly what God intended, invading and disciplining Israel, God turns around and violently punishes Assyria.
Exactly. He punishes Assyria for its haughty pride and its excessive cruelty. God says, in effect, I used you as a tool of discipline, but you didn't do it out of a desire for justice. You did it because you love violence, you love conquest, and you thought you were doing it in your own supreme power.
Wow.
It perfectly illustrates the absolute rule of this framework: instrumentality does not equal innocence. Just because God can use a corrupt system to achieve a purpose doesn't mean he excuses the corruption.
I was trying to think of how to visualize this, and I want to try an analogy.
Mhm.
Imagine a corrupt judge who presides over a trial of a genuinely guilty criminal.
Okay.
The criminal deserves to go to jail, and the judge sentences him to jail.
Oh.
So justice is technically served. But later, it's discovered that the judge didn't sentence the man out of a love for the law. He sentenced him because he was taking bribes from a rival criminal enterprise.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
The outcome was correct, but the judge's motive was entirely wicked. So the judge is then investigated, indicted, and thrown in prison himself. He was an instrument of a necessary outcome, but his heart was utterly corrupt, and he faces absolute accountability for it.
That captures the nuance perfectly. The Assyrian king is the corrupt judge. He delivered a necessary judgment, but he did it out of sheer malice and greed, so he faces his own devastation. And this pattern repeats and intensifies with the next empire on the roster, which is Babylon.
Babylon is a massive focal point in this document.
Yeah.
This is the empire that succeeds Assyria, and they are the ones who actually do the unthinkable. They breach the walls of Jerusalem, they burn the temple of Yahweh to the ground, and they drag the surviving population into a grueling multi-decade exile.
Yes.
Yet the text points to Jeremiah 51, where God calls Babylon a golden cup in the Lord's hand.
He is holding them. He is actively using them to administer the final devastating judgment on a rebellious Jerusalem. But just like Assyria, they are also described as a drunken destroyer, destined for their own ruin. And to really understand the psychology of living under this reality, we have to look at the book of Daniel.
Daniel is such a fascinating case study because he isn't a king or a general. He is a Jewish captive. He's a teenager dragged away from the ashes of his homeland and forced to serve in the royal court of the very empire that destroyed his life.
He is living in the belly of the beast.
Exactly.
And he is surrounded by the overwhelming, intoxicating cultural dominance of Babylon. Babylon wasn't just militarily strong, it was a psychological juggernaut. It had the Hanging Gardens, massive wealth, and an ideology that demanded total assimilation.
Right.
It tried to rewrite the identity of God's people by changing their names, their language, and their diet. It was the absolute zenith of human imperial arrogance.
Yet Daniel receives these prophetic visions that reveal the hidden spiritual reality beneath the golden veneer.
Yes. While Nebuchadnezzar is looking out over his balcony, boasting about the great Babylon he built by his own mighty power, Daniel sees a vision of a massive statue. It's made of different metals, representing the succession of human empires.
Like gold, silver, bronze.
Exactly. And what happens to the statue? A rock, cut not by human hands, strikes the statue on its fragile feet of clay, and the whole magnificent, terrifying structure shatters into dust and blows away in the wind.
Which is the core truth. This framework applies to every empire. They are great, but they are incredibly fragile. They are mortal. They look invincible in the moment, but their days are strictly numbered.
The text leans heavily on the wisdom literature here. It points to Proverbs 21.1. The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will. It points to Psalm 2, where the nations rage, the rulers plot in secret rooms to overthrow the divine order, and God essentially sits in the heavens and laughs.
Wow.
Not a laugh of cruelty, but a laugh at the sheer absurdity of their illusion of autonomy.
The ultimate lesson for the listener is found in Psalm 146. Put not your trust in princes. And you realize it's not just saying that politicians are untrustworthy liars, though that may be true. It's saying human authority is fundamentally fragile.
Right.
When a ruler dies, his plans, his policies, and his empire die with him. You don't put your trust in scaffolding.
Exactly. So we've seen God use empires for oppression, for discipline, and for judgment, but the source material takes a fascinating turn here. It shows that God also uses these massive geopolitical machines for restoration and even for the ultimate act of cosmic redemption.
Oh, this is the good part.
This brings us to what I consider the two biggest plot twists in this entire historical framework, Persia and Rome.
Let's start with Persia, specifically King Cyrus. This is one of the most mind-bending details in the Old Testament. The text points to Isaiah 45:1, where the prophet Isaiah refers to Cyrus, a pagan Persian king who worships other gods, as God's anointed.
We need to pause and absorb how culturally and theologically staggering that word choice is. The Hebrew word used there is Mashiach. It is the exact word from which we derive Messiah.
Wait, really? That's a title exclusively reserved for the high priests or the Davidic kings of Israel. To apply the title of Messiah to a foreign conqueror would have sounded like absolute blasphemy to a Jewish audience.
It would have been deeply offensive. But the framework explains that Cyrus is called anointed not because he had a sudden religious conversion or became covenantally faithful, but because God sovereignly appointed him for a highly specific historical task.
Which was?
He was the geopolitical mechanism God used to decree the return of the Jewish exiles to Jerusalem and fund the rebuilding of the temple.
It is an incredible subversion of power. God literally uses the administration, the military security, and the vast wealth of the Persian Empire to fund the resurrection of his own covenant people. He uses Persian tax dollars to rebuild the temple of Yahweh.
It completely obliterates the idea that God only works through religious insiders or pure holy vessels. He governs pagan rulers to achieve his redemptive purposes.
Which perfectly sets the stage for Rome. Because if Persia is the twist of restoration, Rome is the setting for the ultimate absolute tension in this entire worldview. Rome is the empire that crucifies Christ.
And this is where the framework reaches its climax. The document highlights a single, incredibly dense sentence from the book of Acts, specifically Acts 2.23. The Apostle Peter is preaching, and he says that Jesus was delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, and yet in the very next breath he says, "You crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men."
That is heavy. That one verse encapsulates the entire paradox of divine sovereignty and human culpability. You have the crucifixion fulfilling God's predetermined eternal plan to save the world. It was not an accident. It was not Rome outsmarting God.
Right.
Yet the Roman authorities, Pilate, the soldiers, and the religious leaders who orchestrated the execution are still entirely morally guilty of murder.
They are lawless men. Their actions were part of the plan, but their hearts were filled with hatred, cowardice, and political expediency.
Yeah.
The author of this text points out that this is one of the Bible's hardest yet most liberating truths. Providence is not a moral laundering machine. God does not magically make evil actions good just because He uses them. He triumphs over evil by subverting it.
By turning it on its head.
Yes. The cross is the ultimate proof of this framework. The greatest act of human and demonic wickedness in history, the torturous execution of the perfectly innocent Son of God, is judicially subverted to become the exact mechanism that secures the salvation of humanity.
It is the ultimate jujitsu move against the empire. Rome thinks they are flexing their absolute supremacy by publicly executing a rebel. And in doing so, they are actually acting as the unwitting priests offering the sacrifice that will ultimately conquer Rome itself.
Which naturally raises a vital question about the nature of government itself.
Right, because if God is constantly using these empires, but also constantly judging them and subverting them, what is the baseline definition of a government in this worldview? Like, are governments and empires inherently evil?
Mm-hmm.
Should a listener just view all state authority as demonic?
The text is exceptionally careful with this nuance. The baseline definition is this empire is a tool, never a god. It is not inherently demonic until it crosses a specific line.
Okay, where's the line?
The author points to the Apostle Paul's writings in Romans 13, which clearly state that civil authority exists as God's servant to maintain order and administer justice. Government is a necessary good because human beings are flawed creatures meant to live under authority. It bears the sword to restrain evil.
It bears the sword, but it does not bear the cross.
Exactly. The state can restrain outward evil, but it cannot redeem the human heart. It is an administrative tool. It becomes demonic like Babel wanting to make a name for itself, or Pharaoh demanding worship, or Rome demanding to be called Lord when it elevates itself from an administrator to an idol. When a nation or a political party demands the ultimate allegiance, unquestioning loyalty, and messianic hope that belongs only to God, it ceases to be a servant of order and becomes a beast of rebellion.
To truly grasp the scale of how these empires fit together, we have to zoom out. We've been looking at specific close-ups, Egypt, Babylon, Rome, but Velasquez provides a phenomenal infographic that maps out the entire cosmic timeline.
It's very comprehensive.
It is labeled the Grand Narrative Framework, and it completely reframes how you look at the timeline of the universe. I want us to really take our time and walk through this because it places our current moment in a profoundly humbling context.
It is a massive scope. The timeline begins outside of human history, with a period labeled eternity to creation to the fall.
So before nations, borders, treaties, or armies ever existed, God existed in perfect eternal glory.
Yes, and when he creates human beings, the political and social structures they form are originally created good. We are social creatures. We are meant to live in ordered, cooperative societies. But the fall introduces a fatal corruption into the DNA of collective human life.
Right. Sin enters the picture.
Pride distorts our structures. What was meant to be cooperative stewardship becomes a violent competition for dominance.
Which leads directly to Babel, the ultimate post-fall mechanism to seek absolute order and security without submitting to God. But the timeline doesn't stop at the fall. It moves into the next major epic covenant, to redemption, to the kingdom.
This is the phase where God actively enters the mess of human history. He doesn't abandon the corrupted structures. He begins the long process of reclaiming them. He calls Abraham, initiating the covenant. He redeems Israel from the furnace of Egypt through the Exodus, proving that he saves not by ignoring evil, but by confronting and defeating it.
And then he establishes the kingdom.
And then he establishes the nation of Israel as a kingdom that is supposed to directly challenge the imperial absolutism of the surrounding nations.
But the tragedy of the Old Testament is that this earthly kingdom fails. Israel's kings become just as corrupt, just as violent, and just as idolatrous as the empires they were supposed to contrast. So the sequence has to move forward from kingdom to exile to restoration to the Messiah.
Because the earthly kings break the covenant, the nation is broken and sent into exile in Babylon. To the human eye, exile looks like the end of the story. It looks like the ultimate defeat of God's plan. But in the divine framework, exile is a purification process.
It changes their perspective.
It strips away their reliance on earthly military power and a physical temple, purifying their hope. They slowly realize they are waiting for a much greater restoration than just moving back to a piece of land in the Middle East. They are waiting for a true king.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the arrival of Jesus. And the context of his arrival is crucial. He comes into the world under the suffocating absolute rule of the Roman Empire. There's this fascinating moment early in his ministry where he is in the desert and he is literally tempted by the devil. And what is the offer? The devil shows him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time and offers them to him. He is offering Jesus the ultimate imperial power, the chance to be the benevolent dictator of the globe.
It is the ultimate temptation to achieve a good end ruling the world through the demonic means of imperial dominance. And Jesus utterly rejects it. He redefines what it means to possess power.
How so?
He inaugurates a kingdom that advances not through the shedding of enemy blood, but through the shedding of his own. He rules through humiliation, service, and ultimately resurrection. He defeats the empire not by raising a bigger army to crush Rome, but by allowing Rome to do its absolute worst and then defeating the power of death itself.
Which brings us to the final stages of this massive timeline church, to judgment, to new creation. The church is formed as a multinational entity. It is the direct reversal of the curse of Babel. Instead of people scattering in confusion, you have the Spirit gathering every tribe, language, and nation into one unified body.
And they live in the tension of the already, but not yet. They live in the shadow of current nations, waiting for the final consummation. The timeline points to the book of Revelation, which portrays Babylon not just as the historical city we talked about earlier, but as an ongoing, ultimate symbol of any godless imperial order that sets itself against God.
And the promise is that it ends.
The promise is that this final collective Babel will face righteous judgment.
But here's where it gets really interesting to me. Look at the very end of that timeline. The final destination of human history isn't one human empire finally getting it right. It isn't a political utopia achieved by human legislation. The timeline ends with the new creation, where the text says the leaves of the tree of life are for the healing of the nations. In this massive cosmic timeline, earthly empires are completely decentered. They aren't the main characters.
No, they are peripheral.
The text quotes Daniel 7.13-14 to show that the final eternal emperor isn't Caesar. It isn't the British Empire. It isn't the United States. It is Christ.
To use theological terms, this completely reframes the telos, the ultimate destination and purpose of human history. The purpose of God governing nations isn't just to engage in endless divine political maneuvering or endless regime changes for the fun of it. The governance has a specific trajectory.
Right.
It is aimed entirely at the glory of Christ and the establishment of his eternal kingdom. Therefore, all earthly sovereignties are penultimate.
Unpack penultimate for us.
It means they are second to last. They are never the final word. They are the scaffolding used to construct a building. Once the building is finished, the scaffolding, no matter how impressive it looked, is torn down and removed.
That is incredibly clarifying. But, as with any massive philosophical framework, when you introduce a concept as absolute as divine sovereignty over history, human logic often takes a sharp left turn. We start drawing conclusions that seem to make sense to our finite minds, but actually completely warp the theology. Velazquez dedicates an entire crucial section to this, outlining 5 common traps and misunderstandings.
And we must cover these, because without these guardrails, this worldview can easily become incredibly toxic, abusive, or paralyzing. The first misunderstanding is treating sovereignty as moral approval. We touched on this with Assyria, but it demands repeating utility is not righteousness.
It's the theological version of the might makes right fallacy. The temptation to look at a nation that is wealthy, militarily dominant, and culturally influential and say, well, they're winning, so God must explicitly approve of everything they are doing. God is on our side.
Exactly.
The text flatly rejects that logic.
Completely. God used Babylon to achieve a purpose, but God utterly condemned Babylon's moral character. A nation's historical dominance is never a rubber stamp of divine moral approval for its policies.
The second misunderstanding is one that I think trips up almost everyone who wrestles with this turning providence into passivity.
This is the fatalistic idea that if God is in ultimate control of everything, then human choices don't actually matter.
Right, and I have to challenge this directly because it is the most common logical reaction. If you truly, deeply believe that the outcome of history is entirely in God's hands, that he already knows what's going to happen, and he has already appointed the kings and the rulers, why should anyone get off the couch?
It's a fair question.
Why bother voting? Why spend your life advocating for justice or protesting corruption or trying to alleviate poverty? Why do anything if the script is already written and the final act is guaranteed?
It is the ultimate philosophical hurdle. But the framework provides a profoundly robust psychological and theological answer. True understanding of sovereignty energizes responsibility. It doesn't erase it. Because God is in control, human obedience is never wasted.
Explain how that actually works in practice. How does knowing the end of the story free you up to act?
Think about the alternative. If history was truly just a chaotic, meaningless void, governed only by chance and the raw power of the strongest dictator, your small act of justice, your single vote, your protest, your soup kitchen, would be utterly meaningless against the overwhelming tide of entropy.
It would be like trying to stop a Category 5 hurricane by plugging in a desk fan.
Yes.
You would burn out instantly because the burden of saving the world is entirely on your shoulders, and you clearly aren't strong enough.
Exactly. The psychological weight of trying to save a chaotic world will crush you. But because history is governed by a sovereign moral God, the burden of securing the final victory is lifted off your shoulders. You don't have to save the world is already saved.
Oh, that's a huge shift.
What that does is free your energy to focus entirely on faithfulness in the present moment. Every act of integrity, every pursuit of justice, every quiet prayer is woven into a narrative that has a guaranteed righteous conclusion. God ordains not just the final ends, but the everyday means. And human obedience is the primary means he chooses to use. You act with courage precisely because you know your actions aren't echoing into an empty void.
That makes profound sense. It cures both the anxiety of failure and the arrogance of success. Okay, the third misunderstanding is baptizing national identity. This is the danger of confusing your earthly, passport-holding citizenship with the kingdom of God.
The author gives a stern warning here. When believers identify too closely with a specific nation, a dangerous psychological shift happens. They begin to interpret valid, necessary political criticism of their country as religious persecution.
Oh, wow.
They mistake their nation's wealth and privilege for divine righteousness. Biblical faith insists that while earthly citizenship is real, and it involves real duties to your neighbor, it is strictly relative. Your deepest, most foundational allegiance belongs to a kingdom that transcends every border.
Which leads right into the fourth danger reading history with panic or conspiracy. We see this constantly today. The news cycle hits, a crisis emerges, and suddenly everyone is sharing elaborate conspiracy theories, convinced the world is entirely out of control or that some secret, omnipotent cabal of human elites is absolutely sovereign over our fate.
It's a coping mechanism. If you forget that God is sovereign, but you recognize that the world is chaotic, you have to find someone else to blame for the chaos. You have to invent a secret villain who is pulling all the strings to make sense of the fear. But the text argues that believers are insulated from this panic.
Because God is still on the throne.
The nations are not out of control. History is not a contest between God and chaos where God might accidentally lose.
To be clear, that doesn't mean suffering is painless. When the economy crashes or a war breaks out, the pain is incredibly real.
Absolutely. It doesn't numb the pain, but it makes trust possible. You can grieve the tragedy without losing your mind to conspiracy because you know the throne of the universe is not empty.
And the final misunderstanding the text outlines is forgetting the cross-shaped pattern of rule. It is the perennial temptation to think that God's kingdom advances through imperial power, legislative dominance, and cultural aggression.
Christians are explicitly warned here to beware of any vision of national power that cannot tolerate weakness, suffering, patience, or sacrificial love. If your political theology requires you to act like Caesar to protect the church, you have abandoned the theology of the cross. The kingdom of God advances through the methods of Christ, the crucified serving king, not through the coercive methods of empire.
So moving from this incredibly high-level philosophical theology down to boots-on-the-ground reality, how does Velazquez suggest this massive worldview should actually alter the daily life of a listener? Section 7 breaks down the practical implications, and I want to walk through how this changes a person's day-to-day existence.
The first practical implication is political humility. If you truly believe that no nation is identical with God's reign, it completely severs the root of nationalism and political triumphalism. It guards against ideological idolatry, the belief that your political party is the ultimate force for good in the universe. But equally important, it guards against crushing despair when political systems inevitably disappoint you. Governments matter deeply. They keep order, they build roads, they prosecute crimes, but they are not saviors.
I love that. When you lower your expectations of what a government can actually achieve, you ironically become a much better, more sober-minded citizen. Which ties right into the next point, public engagement. You still serve the common good, you work for justice, but you do it without messianic expectations. You aren't electing a savior, you're electing an administrator. You don't demand that a politician provide your soul with ultimate meaning.
And then there is the profound implication for suffering. For believers living under genuinely unjust, totalitarian, or oppressive regimes today, this theology offers an incredibly resilient courage. The text reminds them that totalitarian systems do not intimidate the Lord of history.
That's a comforting thought.
Babylon didn't surprise him, Rome didn't defeat him, and modern dictatorships do not threaten him. The endurance of the faithful is grounded in the absolute kingship of Christ, not in the benevolence of human rulers.
The text also brings up the practice of prayer, specifically referencing Paul's instruction in 1 Timothy 2.104, which commands believers to pray for kings and all who are in high positions. If God is just a clockmaker who wound up the universe, stepped back, and is letting it run down on its own, then praying for political leaders is just useless psychological meditation.
Right.
But if this framework is true and he actually dynamically governs the hearts of nations, then prayer changes everything.
It becomes an act of active participation in divine governance. You are praying with the absolute trust that God can alter the hearts of kings, change the trajectory of legislation, and open doors for peace and human flourishing.
The final practical implication is mission. And this is fascinating because it's about looking at the physical infrastructure of empires, their roads, their trade routes, their massive migrations, and their forced language assimilations, and seeing them as providential pathways for sharing the gospel.
This is where history is so incredibly illustrative. Think about the Roman Empire. Rome built this vast, unprecedented network of paved roads. They established the Pax Romana, a period of relative peace and stability across the Mediterranean. Why did Rome do this?
To control everyone.
They built the roads to march their legions rapidly, to crush rebellions. They enforced peace to extract taxes efficiently. It was entirely self-serving, brutal, imperial infrastructure.
But God looks at that infrastructure and uses it for the exact opposite purpose. Those same Roman roads, built to march legions and subjugate the world, became the exact safe pathways that the Apostle Paul and the early Christians used to walk from city to city, spreading the message of a resurrected, crucified king. Rome built the infrastructure to glorify Caesar, and God used it to conquer Rome with the gospel of Christ.
It is the ultimate display of sovereignty subverting empire. God arranges the macro movements of history, even the oppressive ones, so that people can ultimately be reached with grace.
I think about how this connects directly to the listener's experience of modern media consumption. The text explicitly says that pastors and leaders need to teach people how to read the news theologically.
Yes, that's crucial.
So tomorrow morning, when you're sitting on your couch drinking your coffee, and your phone buzzes with a breaking news alert about a shifting border, a massive political crisis, or an election result that terrifies you, you aren't supposed to be naive. You don't ignore it, and you don't pretend it doesn't matter. But you also aren't supposed to be politically intoxicated or paralyzed by panic.
You view that news alert through the lens of the grand narrative. What does this all mean for the listener today? It means that your faithful response to the chaos of the world is simple, yet profound. You seek justice in your local community, you speak the truth calmly, you serve your neighbors sacrificially,
And you resist the idolatry.
and you vehemently resist idolatry, especially the idolatry of the state demanding your ultimate hope. You do all of this while holding fast to the unshakable, historically proven promise that every single empire passes away.
So to briefly recap this massive cosmic journey we've taken today, we've explored a worldview where history is not an arena of brute force, and it is certainly not a chaotic, meaningless accident. It is a highly orchestrated stage. And on that stage, empires rise and fall as tools in a divine narrative.
From the centralized pride of Babel, to the stubborn oppression of Egypt, to the harsh discipline of Babylon and the paved roads of Rome.
Nations serve God's ultimate purposes. They face absolute, terrifying moral accountability for their actions, and ultimately, whether they realize it or not, they merely serve as the temporary scaffolding to pave the way for a kingdom that will not pass away.
The central liberating tension holds true. God is entirely sovereign over the arc of history. Human beings are entirely responsible for their moral choices, and the final word belongs not to the shifting powers of this age, but to Christ.
And as we close, we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We've seen throughout this text that every great historical empire, from Egypt to Babylon to Rome, suffered from the exact same delusion. They all believed in their own absolute permanence.
They all built monuments thinking they were the end of history.
And they were all proven wrong, revealed by time as temporary tools that eventually turned into dust. If that level of absolute self-deception is a universal human trait on a geopolitical scale, it demands we look in the mirror. What invisible empires in our own personal lives, in our careers, in our relentless pursuit of wealth, or in the modern social structures we obsess over, are we currently treating as ultimate and permanent? What are we exhaustingly building right now that we think will last forever when it might just be temporary scaffolding for something much greater?
It's a deeply humbling question, and it's one that should completely change how you view everything, from the global stage of the morning news to your own daily ambitions.
Thank you for joining us on this complex, deeply thought-provoking deep dive into this incredible worldview. If you're listening and feeling a sense of relief from the anxiety of the modern news cycle, we invite you to keep questioning, keep learning, and to join us again for our next exploration. Until then, remember that the loudest voice in the room isn't always the one writing the script.